This is the first of 3 launches, so I hope you've got your stamina for this week and next ready, of Caribbean Literature in Transition. And we're going to start with the contemporary moment and move backward through the launches. So I guess it's important to say that I'm kind of going first today as the general editor for the project, and I hope I stepped up to that task. But the completion of these volumes has absolutely been a collective endeavour and achievement. So it was initially prompted about 5 years ago by an invitation from Ray Ryan at CUP when I was on holiday in Lake Garda, and I felt everything felt possible at that moment. And actually everything was possible, not thanks to Lake Garda and a large glass of Prosecco, but thanks to the mammoth effort of a wonderful editorial team. So my co-editor on this project, who I will hand over to shortly, Ronald Cummings, but also the editors for Volume 2, Rafe DeLeo and Cadella Forbes, which will be launching tomorrow at the same time, and the editors of Volume 1, Evelyn O'Callaghan and Tim Watson, which will be launching a week today. So I also want to make special mention to our magnificent research associate, Marta Fernandez-Campa, who helped us bring the 99-page book proposal together, and whose insights were really important to helping shape the project. From that stage of conceptualization to the actualization, that was obviously through the talent and labor of all the contributors. And we made an effort to try and recruit a team for this project who represented a lot of the different locations in which Caribbean literary studies are happening and the different generations across which it's happening too. Some of whom will speak shortly, and more of whom hopefully you'll see when we have a chance to chat in the Q&A. I just want to say that obviously a project of this kind is a lot of work, but it's also a privilege. It gives a really rare opportunity to reflect on the field as a whole and to try and think what it might mean to present it with fresh eyes. As those of us who work in this field already know, in relation to Caribbean literature, the definitional parameters are fluid and fascinating and sometimes defended with fury. So those questions of where counts, when counts, who counts were really interesting ones to think about from now. And I think we were aware that we were shaping a scholarly inheritance for our own moment, and that was a powerful opportunity. And we took it very much as a moment to challenge the halo version of Caribbean literature, the Nobel sort of prize-winning figures, as being this kind of halo from which everything else takes its shine, and to really try to insist on a much longer and fuller literary history is often commonly acknowledged. So some of the big gestures towards that were, of course, the gestures of chronology, to take this back to 1800 and right up to 2020. But also to try to represent the multi-locationality and the multilingual nature of Caribbean literature at the same time as knowing that we are writing for an English-speaking audience. So as much as I think we were all aware when we worked on this project that collections are powerful tools of canon making, we wanted consciously actually to use the collection to point to what more needed to be said and known about the field. So the intention has been to deliberately fray the edges rather than neaten the seams, to demonstrate the need to keep returning to what's less seen, what's less known, and what's been disavowed. So I guess in a way, I see this project as not only mapping the transitions that characterize Caribbean literature, and Ronald will speak in just a moment about how we did that, but also as a kind, I hope, of transition in itself, as a marking of an expansion of critical inquiry, an expansion of Caribbean literary history, and also a kind of inspiration to those of you out there who might just be beginning to explore this field, to make a critical intervention, to not receive what we've the version we've given as the field itself, but to think of it as a provocation, so that in the next iteration, this Caribbean Literature in Transition will need 6 volumes rather than 3. I think we already knew that by the time we finished it. So I'm really proud to have been part of this collective project, and I hope that it will be redefining rather than definitive, and that, you know, it will be part of conversations to come. And I'm going to hand over now to Ronald.
Okay, thanks for those comments, Alison. It's great to be here with you all and to celebrate this volume, which is really a sort of landmark in terms of thinking about Caribbean literary historiography. A project such as this is haunted by the question of periodization, which as literary scholars we know is one that is always fraught. And in thinking about the concept of transition, a concept which we'll come back to at several points today as each of the speakers talk about their work, I want to note one way in which we have grappled with this question throughout this whole series of books. So you will note, for instance, that there's an overlap in terms of years when the volumes start and end. So volume 3, which starts in 1970, overlaps with volume 2, which ends in 1970. And there are things and approaches that are specific to volume 2, but not volume 3, as well as there are also direct overlaps. And in saying this, there is an invitation here to read across the volumes, to engage these lines as blurred ones rather than as sharp or defined ones. We also want to invite folks to reflect on, to grapple with, to challenge, and maybe even to reject our logics of periodization. But as part of my brief comments here today, I want to quickly reflect on why 1970 and why 2020. The first volume in this Caribbean Literatures in Transition series covers 1800 to 1920. Volumes 2 and volume 2 and volume 3, by contrast, cover 50 years each. And this is because there was a lot going on. We might note a number of convergences in the years surrounding 1970, for instance. As we were reminded last week in a scintillating lecture delivered by Professor Kenneth Ramchand, the first course in West Indian literature at University of the West Indies was offered in 1969. And we might read that as a sort of moment of consolidation or an opening in the field. And this was followed by other courses such as Frank Burbelsing's course on West Indian literature at York University in Canada in 1970. Maureen Warner-Lewis returned to the Caribbean from Nigeria in 1970 and was hired as a lecturer and English tutor at the University of the West Indies. And she would go on to develop courses on orality and African literatures, as well to offer a sort of rigorous framework for thinking about Africa and the Caribbean relationally. In 1970, the poet and scholar Marvin Morris also began lecturing at the University of the West Indies. In other words, there were shifts in the conceptualization and teaching of the field happening at the time that would lead to further institutional shifts and transitions. In 1970, there was also the student-led occupation at the Creative Arts Center, where students raised questions about the form and practice of Caribbean cultural production, calling for an attention to more recognizably Caribbean aesthetics, which would break from colonial and European forms that had preceded that moment. As Sylvia Wynter put it, writing in the Daily Gleaner on the 29th of March, 1970, a new society groping to find expression must be concerned with creativity. Much of this creativity is raw and new and fumbling. I mention this event in part because it seems to me that the 50th anniversary of this important intervention has passed relatively unmentioned, shrouded as it has been by the ongoing pandemic. In our introduction to the book, we talk about a range of other things that marked that time, including the now legendary 1971 ACLA's conference, which saw both V.S. Naipaul and Kamau Brathwaite sounding off on the function of the writer in our society. We also noted the founding of the journal Savaku in 1970. And while this is a rich volume, and in all of the excellent essays by our contributors, there's much to be devoured, we wish there was space for other things, such as a wider comparative exploration of the journals founded in this most recent period. How might we also tell the stories of the journals not only coming out of the University of the West Indies, such as the Journal of West Indian Literature and Small Acts, but also from the University University of Puerto Rico with journals such as Caribbean Studies, Caribbean Review, and more recently Sargasso, which have all been important to marking and making Caribbean literatures in transition. When we started working on this volume, we had initially planned to end its chronology in 2015. It seemed sensible at the time to focus on a temporal marker and moment that had passed, as opposed to writing this history as it was unfolding. But so much was happening post-2015, like the number of prizes that were being awarded to Caribbean writers and which they still continue to win. And it seemed important to us to try to capture and reflect on this sense of excitement and growth in the field. Eventually, the half-century mark of 1970 to 2020 seemed appropriate. But we might also agree that 2020 has turned out to be an appropriate time to end this survey for other reasons. It has been a rupture in time for different reasons and in different ways. And what might occur hereafter will be different and will require, to use Sylvia Wynter's phrase, new expression. We look forward to new histories that will be written beyond this moment. Our volume is organized into 4 sections, and we've invited contributors from each of the 4 sections to talk about their work and about these sections. And I will not read their bios. I will place their bios in the chat as we go along, but I will introduce them by mentioning their contributions to this volume. And I will mention them in the order in which they will speak, and they will come on hereafter to share their reflections. So section 1 of the book focuses on what we have called literary and generic transitions. And Denise DeCaires-Narret has contributed an excellent essay on life writing and Caribbean narrative. And she will talk about that and about that section on literary and generic transitions. The second section is titled Cultural and Political Transitions, and Ifiona Fulani has contributed a wonderful essay on developing and sustaining literary publics, prizes, festivals, and new writing, and she will situate that in relationship to the wider question of cultural and political transitions. Our third speaker will be Kezia Page, and she will be speaking about her essay, Caribbean Subjects in the World, in the context of the section on the Caribbean region in transition, which maps various travels and movements. And our final speaker will be Kezia Valance, who will be talking about the section titled Critical Transformations, and situating her essay, Caribbean Eco-Poetics, the Categorical Imperative and Indifference in the Caribbean Environment, within that examination of what we've called critical transitions. So they will be speaking in that order. Denise, Ifiona, Kezia, over to you.
Hi. I'm sitting on a stool because that's what my son uses to work on his computer, so I'm completely off balance. But I spent the morning lying prone, enjoying all the essays in the section that I contributed to. And if anything, I think the sense I have from that is a sense of how that kind of thing that we say often about the Caribbean genres being very malleable and promiscuous and so on. What I think is really interesting about all of these, the contributions that I read today, is a way in which those connections are becoming much more diverse, much less predictable, sometimes quite erratic and fragmented and particular. And I think that's a really interesting kind of shift, you know, in the sense that it's sort of critical promiscuity to the max seems to be the thing that's happening here, which I think is great. So I'm just going to say something very briefly about each of the chapters and then quickly something about my own. So Tanya Shields, I think her piece on From Plantation to Plot, for me really resonated because of the way in which it talks about constantly sort of rehearsing the past and in a sense performing memory in lots of various iterations, so that we're having a much less kind of monumental idea of history, it seems to me, in how she's approaching history. And I really appreciated the way in which her idea of rehearsing the past emphasizes performativity. And so it doesn't take history for granted as some kind of monolith. And similarly, Shivani Ramlochan, it's not exactly similar, but there is a connection. In the absence of historical archives, she argues that creative writing steps in. And that may sound like something that we're familiar with from other cultural context and from the Caribbean, critical discourses that we all know. But I think there was something very particular about the way she is accounting for this kind of raiding of the archives. And she says, this is a quote, "The way forward can only be through further fearless specificity." And this for me, I think really speaks as a kind of powerful statement about where we are at this moment in Caribbean writing. So that, this demand for further fearless specificity, rather than always having to speak for the generic and the general and so on, the representative. Emily Zobel Marshall also is writing on something that is familiar to many of us about the popular, but she's making an argument in a sense that the popular is particular. And I really like that kind of resonance. And again, I'm going to quote from her. She says, "The oral is always whispering below the surface of the written text." And I would argue that from her chapter, she suggests that it surfaces in the text as not simply a cause for celebration, but also for critique. So the oral is now performing, it seems to me, in her argument, a more choppy, frictive kind of role than we are perhaps accustomed to thinking about it operating as, either you're for popular culture or against. This is a much more nuanced kind of argument. And Susan Jingle, in her piece on dub, again, expands the idea of dub, into a much wider range of repertoires. So diasporic, vegan, domestic, all of those kinds of multiple directions that she takes dub into were certainly opened my critical eyes. But also the way in which she insists on life-making needs and desires of the particular dub poet is kind of driven by their specificity in their specific context, rather than, again, dub being something that comes out of a very shared sense of context. So she's very good at, I think, at challenging Kai Miller's argument about the death of dub by saying it's still alive, and it's alive because we have to recognize it, we have to read differently, listen differently to pick up on all those different kinds of nuances. And then Christopher Winks, I think, again, continues the sort of familiar discussion about the continuities from plantation violence to the contemporary urban spaces. But I think what he does really usefully is to show us how contemporary novels propose a decolonial reconstructive poetics as a first step to imagining the Caribbean urban space otherwise. And what I particularly liked about his was a kind of note of optimism, that it is not all, that something energizing can be retrieved from this. Okay, and just quickly, because I think I must be getting to 8 minutes. Rebecca Ramdani opens up definitions of speculative fiction to go back through works that we thought we knew were not speculative fiction to make quite interesting arguments about how they might be. So again, messing up the boundaries of speculative fiction. And finally, Justine McConnell arguing that drama has long been impossible to kind of fix and is constantly evolving its language and forms. And I suppose it was Kai Miller's that resonated most strongly with mine. And he makes an argument about revisiting that idea of the problem of form that Gordon Rollaire raised all those years ago. And I think the gist of Kai's argument is that rather than seeing it as the problem of form, in his argument, I get a sense that he's talking about the possibilities of form, the kind of endless possibilities of form, rather than the problem. So it seems to me to speak to a very bold and confident kind of literary sensibility that is not as bothered about categories and definitions as perhaps they were. So again, I'm going to quote from him. He says, increasingly bold and experimental Caribbean Caribbean creative nonfiction does not shy away from claiming the self, even as it says to the world, here we are the other. And it's this sense of claiming multiple selves that I think speaks to what I was trying to get at with the life writing chapter that I wrote. And I should say, first of all, that the thing that was hardest about writing that chapter was the absolutely amazing array of material. It was almost impossible. It gave me many sleepless nights trying to figure who to use, who to cut, and I think it speaks to a really vibrant field of writing. But I guess what I would maybe say about life writing, thanks, Alison, about life writing at the moment, is that it makes the argument for life writing on a kind of continuum with making a life. So this idea of making a life, which is a very resonant kind of phrase in much Caribbean life and Caribbean writing, and I think it speaks to that mutually constitutive kind of circulation of ideas. But also that as a discourse, life writing has always been very promiscuous. And I think it is now being used because it is so capacious and so responsive to the hybrid demands of Caribbean self-making. So I suppose it seems to me that life writing is a kind of doing writing. It's a making, it's labor, you know, it involves quite serious labor. You know, if you think just off the top of my head, thinking of someone like Lorna Goodison, who took something like 20 years, I think she said, to write her Harvey River. So life writing is a kind of labor. But also I think life writing as a context in which individual self-making is an ongoing and persistent process. It doesn't have an end. And I just want to finally finish by pointing those of you who haven't come across it yet, Dion Brand's new book, which is called An Autobiography of the Autobiography of Reading, which came out in 2020, which I've just been reading. And it's just brilliant because it speaks to this way in which the Caribbean self is constantly making new selves through that kind of archival backtracking and then forward thinking. So I'm going to end with that. I think that's 8 minutes, right? Thank you very much. And now I'm going to pass you on to Ifiona, who is going to speak about the next section. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
You're muted, Ifiona.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. And my thanks to Alison and Ron for inviting me to participate in this absolutely amazing project. I'm going to speak a little bit about the section titled Cultural Politics, Cultural and Political Transitions, and to make a few comments that I think are important about each of the essays in the chapter. The essays in this section reflect on transformative and revolutionary developments that impacted the field and increased public participation in Caribbean literary culture at large over the last 50 years. Simone Alexander's chapter titled Feminist Criticism Towards a New Canon of Caribbean Feminist Theory and Theorizing maps the emergence and development of a specifically Caribbean literary feminism from 1980s onwards. She notes, and this is important, I think, that activists and queer writers based in the region and in North America laid the foundations for gender-based analysis that had local bearings and made attention to sexuality and intersectionality critical priorities. This coalescence that formed of critics and writers, combined with their scholarly and creative input, transformed the field, effectively ending male dominance of the canon. A number of landmark publications, essay volumes, and anthologies of creative writing was instrumental in this process. And it was helpful to me to be reminded of the important role played by, these collections of writing. For example, Her True Name, edited by Pamela Mordecai and Betty Wilson, Out of the Kumbla, which just celebrated its 30th birthday. Woman Version, Theoretical Approaches to West Indian Fiction by Evelyn O'Callaghan, and more recently, Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thoughts, Genealogies, Theories, Enactments, edited by Gabrielle Hussein and Lisa Alter, just to name a few. The Association of Caribbean Women Writers and Scholars, founded in 1994, provided focus and momentum for the work of promoting ongoing cross-cultural and pan-Caribbean connections between women writers and scholars. The chapter titled Digital Yards, Caribbean Writing on Social Media and Other Digital Platforms by Kelly Baker-Joseph, to my mind, extends the discussion on evolving transnational networks and dialogues by reflecting on the impact of digital and virtual communications in and on the field. The chapter takes as its starting point Kamau Brathwaite's designation of the yard in its Caribbean meaning of, shared communal space as a dynamic locus of creativity and communication. Kelly argues that it's the digital space online that most corresponds with Brathwaite's theorization of the yard, particularly social media sites, blogs, Facebook, and other platforms that provide space for appreciating, reviewing, and sharing creative writing. So recognition of the enabling potential of social media comes with a warning from Kelly of the incipient risk implicit in the impermanence of these platforms. The loss of stories due to defunct blogs and publications and broken links is already a reality. Kelly concludes that ironically, print media might be a means of preserving digital creation and communication, for example, via citations and references in print publications. Right. So hold on to that habit of writing and publishing she seems to be advocating. The chapter titled Writing for and of a Revolution by Alison Donnell and Nalini Mohabir examines a body of literary works that engage with and memorialize the region's landmark revolutions in Haiti, Cuba, and Grenada, as well as revolutionary moments such as those like the 1968 Rodney riots in Jamaica, Trinidad's 1970 Black Power Revolution, and the uprisings in Brixton and Yonge Street, Toronto. The chapter refers to literature in a range of genres from across the region to draw attention to their authors' contestation of colonial power structures and cultural hegemonies. To quote from the chapter's conclusion, Caribbean writers continue to generate new literary forms and sustain the conditions for positive imaginings of social transformation and a Caribbean revolutionary sensibility. So my research for the chapter titled Developing and Sustaining Literary Publics, Prizes, Festivals, and New Writing confirms the power of the literary prize to garner publicity, visibility, and increased book sales for prize winners. I think this has been demonstrated vividly by the recent impressive roster of wins by Caribbean writers of international prizes, such as the Booker, the T.S. Eliot Prize, and the Griffin Prize, which have propelled, Marlon James, Aisha Hutchinson, and others to international fame. However, similar benefits, albeit on a smaller scale, also follow for the winners of established Caribbean-based prizes, notably the Guyana Prize, Cuba's Casa de las Americas Prize, as well as the more recent Bocas Prize. Winning a local prize is like a guarantee of authenticity to readers and publishers abroad. Shortlisted and prize-winning fiction and their authors attract a wider international audience. And it seems that audiences are generally more interested in fiction, even though Caribbean writers are excelling in the genre of poetry. But novels are more likely to be reviewed in the metropolitan prestige press. Prizes and their benefits have renewed a trajectory towards Europe and the USA that has the potential to distract Caribbean writers away from the region-centered, regionally inclusive goals of the Casa de las Americas Prize and the Guyana Prize, which both envisioned constituting a linguistically inclusive Caribbean literature built on commonalities of history, cultural values, and elements of common heritage. The organizers of the region's literary festivals have taken up the task of recentering and promoting Caribbean writing in the region. the Calabash Festival in Jamaica, and Bocas Lit Fest in Trinidad, both aim to grow local audiences from all social classes, prioritizing the cultivation of region-based audiences for Caribbean literature. Although I should add that Bocas also aims to promote Caribbean literature abroad. Both festivals organize ongoing support for emerging writers, for example, Calabash's Writers' Workshop and Bocas's year-long mentoring projects for emerging writers, as well as their outreach to school. However, a limitation of both festivals is their focus on literature in English. By contrast, the smaller biannual festival in Guadeloupe, which also awards a prize, is working to realize that vision of the Guyana Prize and the Casa de las Americas Prize of a pan-Caribbean literature and as a linguistically inclusive literary community. Yeah. So I'm going to pass on now to Kezia. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I am pleased to spend a few minutes with you across place and time zone to join in the conversation about these 3 exceptional volumes that center Caribbean literature. I will talk to you today about part 3 of this volume, which is titled The Caribbean Region in Transition. The 5 essays in this section are The Caribbean and Britain, Acts of Trespass and Collapsing Borders, Alternate Landscapes in Contemporary Caribbean Canadian Literature, The Caribbean in the United States, The Caribbean and the Tourist Gaze, and Caribbean Subjects in the World. I share the titles of the essays with you because they helpfully lay out the geographies that the Caribbean region in transition inhabits, defies, and complicates. They investigate afresh the places we have occupied and that have occupied us, Britain, Canada, and the US. But part of the fascinating contribution of this section is the way the essays also address places beyond these traditional geographies. All the essays in this section seek in some way to acknowledge the ways the real and teeming and grounded Caribbean is complicated by its decentered diasporas and the wide open borderlessness of the region imagined. The 5 essays focus on literature and publishing and the politics of it, and on the transitions that anthologies trace for us. As well, they meditate on how different generations navigate space, politics, and history, and how the identifying marker Caribbean has generational elasticity. The section also explores the Caribbean considering outsiders, as they define us, and how these considerations produce a redrawing of the region from local perspectives. And I share a brief moment with you, similar to Denise's, as a contributor and now reader of the volume, to say that the challenge of writing about so many texts pales in comparison to the reward of experiencing the blooming literary landscape of the region in each essay. And as I say that, just to say that, these are really short thoughts on each essay. So Sarah Lawson Welsh's discussion of the Caribbean and Britain pays close attention to the marked transitions that distinguish the Windrush generation of writers from later authors who went to England as children and come of age with a different relationship to Caribbean British life and aesthetic, and then still a later generation who craft a more dynamic sense of their transnational belonging. Lawson Welsh calls into question the critical formulation Caribbean British as she works through which UK resident writers get called Caribbean British and which ones don't. She's fascinated too by how political and social events and anniversaries, how writers take on these public moments and how that has had an impact on the reception and the visibility of Caribbean British writing and writers. Camille Isaac's essay on Caribbean Canadian literature argues that Caribbean Canadian literature has expanded the terrain of Caribbean writing and redefined the Canadian literary scene. Isaacs focuses on the racial tensions in 1980s and 1990s Toronto as a transition moment for the literature and as a jumping off point for her discussion of racism and exclusion in publishing and the importance of community audiences and small presses to counteract that. Jocelyn Fenton Stitt's essay begins by acknowledging that Caribbean literature has fought for a place in the US Academy. She argues that even if Caribbean authors no longer see Europe as the center of high culture and the publishing world, they still negotiate an uncertain place within the US publishing industry. Her argument that Caribbean writers are absorbed and taught in relation to their linguistic heritage, except for the authors who are not, and not necessarily within the complexity and the context of the region, is noteworthy. Supriya Nair's The Caribbean and the Tourist Gaze reads literature alongside social science studies of tourism to transition our understanding of the relationship beyond the North-South dynamic that we expect from this discussion. She moves to an analysis of a regional dilemma that Caribbean writers and artists were willing to tackle and prophesy on the complicated need and impact of tourism long before policymakers and politicians. Nair points out that the literature resists a homogeneous notion of the tourist gaze and presents contested rather than static gazes. Nair suggests that tourism writings are an aperture onto social collapse and are often elegies for the reality of the landscape that is concealed by tourism development. My own essay in this section examines new texts that chart a journey away from the creative and critical paradigms predicted by the residual influence of empire and neo-empire. These works, or the works that I examine, move beyond imperial designations of language and culture to explore the globe and test the ideas about and limits of their freedom to be in and to claim the globe. Their journeys are outside of the Black Atlantic and Kalapani as they go to elsewhere, such as Scandinavia, the Middle East, and in unprecedented circuits and locations on the African continent itself. The texts skip around and across languages as though colonial divides or culturally other spaces were no longer a pertinent concern or a barrier for knowledge and belonging. The essay looks at the implications for how we chart new shifts in the Caribbean canons and the language we will use beyond diaspora and places we will include on Caribbean literature syllabi. So that was the quickest leg. Thank you. And Keja, you're next.
Thank you. Hearing these summaries of the rich work just is a reminder of what an incredible set of both the diversity and the overlaps amongst these pieces. And I want to say, I spent my years as a graduate student. The end of my graduate studies was when Alison Donnell's first set of anthologies of Caribbean literature and literary studies came out. And I've continued to teach those, increasingly wishing for more and updated and new. And so I am just so pleased that this is here and available and to be part of it. One of the things that this section on critical transitions, I want to pick up on what Denise said at the beginning. These are all pieces about critical promiscuity. And if critical transitions of 1970 to 2020 are showing us anything, it is about critical promiscuity overall. And one of the things that brings these pieces together is a really, if literary criticism is about, or has been in large part about, defining genres and defining borders and all of these sort of definitions, and here's where we can categorize this and here's where we can categorize that. All of these pieces are challenging the terms of categorization and the lines of division that happen as we categorize. And they're challenging them in some really interesting and different ways. And so the first piece in this section is Marta Fernandez Campa's Dialogic Connections in Caribbean Literature and Visual Art. And as you can see from the title, one of the boundaries that this one is challenging is the boundary between literature and visual art. and the ways in which, by looking at both Caribbean literature that is in dialogue with Caribbean art, but also the huge number of Caribbean writers who are also artists, who are also visual artists, who are also sculptors, who are also photographers. Marta Fernandez Campa is really bringing out the idea of a Caribbean aesthetics that is both literary and visual and tactile, and a new way of thinking about aesthetics in that cross-disciplinary way, looking particularly at the Caribbean artists movement, which is a central movement in bringing this forward. So it is both a study of a movement and a study of artists. The intertextuality is the focus. Intertextuality within works of literature is the focus of the next chapter in this section, from countertextuality to intertextuality, continuing the Caribbean canon. And again, Emily Taylor in this piece is examining the ways in which, if an earlier period of intertextuality was characterized by Caribbean authors writing back, right, countering the textual representations of the Caribbean from colonial and neo-colonial writers, in the period from 1970 to 2020, intertextuality, not only among visual and literary artists, but Emily Taylor is looking at the ways in which intertextuality among Caribbean writers, forming expressions of Caribbean relation. And I really think all of these chapters, if there's a kind of one critical piece that can bring these together, it's Glissant's notion of relation, of relation, and Emily Taylor is looking at the ways in which Caribbean writers express relation amongst one another and build community through this intertextuality, and build a community that is not always responding to the negative from the outside, but also building this celebration from the inside and exploration of what happens when Caribbean writers read and write up to one another. And this is part of the awareness and ability to do that. I also want to say all of the chapters in this section are really deeply thinking across linguistic and colonial legacy boundaries. And this, again, is one of those moments where this is a kind of promiscuity of sort of disrespecting those colonial boundaries, but also really embracing the mixing of languages. So it is both conversations across languages and bringing different linguistic and literary traditions and artistic traditions together, but also the Creole languages that emerge from that, and the plays with language that emerge from that. My piece in this section is Caribbean eco-poetics, the categorial imperative and indifference in the Caribbean environment, and similarly thinking about the problem of categories, right? So the categorial imperative, sort of from Linnaeus, from the colonial perspective of trying to divide, name, own, right? And the ways in which, since the very beginning, but really picking up on the ways that contemporary and since 1970, Caribbean writers are really challenging not the notion of difference, but the lines of difference. And in the eco-poetic sphere, this is the lines of differentiation between human and environment, between human and animal, between human and rock, between human and spirit. And looking at all of the ways in which Caribbean writers are rethinking relation within that. And one of the ways that manifests is also in rethinking the boundaries of the binary gender boundaries and the ways that those translate into considering sexuality and gender in binary terms. And so interestingly, the end of my piece moves into talking about Thomas Glave and other queer Caribbean writers who are challenging the possibility, all of the possibilities of the ways that ecosystems are supposed to divide and conquer not only who lives where, but also how they relate. And so again, this new modes of relation, which as if we had been writing in conversation from the beginning in that chapter 23, sexual subjects, Faisal Dean and Ronald Cummings are again examining the ways in which Thomas Glave's Our Caribbean really holds the space for all of these coming together of what can be called queer Caribbean, what can be called non-heteronormative. And one of the things that Faisal Dean and Ronald Cummings are developing are multiple modes of designating gender and sexual configurations, notions of identity, but also notions of non-identification across these spaces of connection, of pleasure, and the ways in which Our Caribbean also was an early, really pan-Caribbean collection that opens this space of a wonderful outpouring of new writing, which also comes to the question of location and of where sexual subjects, where Caribbean sexual subjects can express themselves. So considering sort of coming towards the dissident book and coming towards all of the moments of voluntary and involuntary movement across within and beyond the Caribbean, looking at Before Night Falls, Reina las Arenas, and also, and I think this is sort of concluding with a consideration of HIV and AIDS. And I think one of the things that all of these pieces are contending with and continue to contend with is, promiscuity is both fantastically pleasurable and incredibly dangerous. And dealing with and looking at the ways in which the critical notion of celebration and is relatively new. The critical sort of thinking in the Caribbean in earlier periods has focused importantly on resistance. And in this section, there is all of the chapters are thinking through both that continued resistance, the continued threat, and moving towards celebration, which gets to the very last chapter of the book, which is sort of in this section, and really the last chapter in concluding the whole book, Alison Donnell's Caribbean Literature and Literary Studies, Past, Present, and Future, that really reminds the ways in which, as much as there is this vibrant, incredible cross-pollination within Caribbean literature and within Caribbean critical traditions, how that past gets held in this moving forward is of concern and is a space for another set of relation, past and present. And there's so much more to be said about each of these pieces and about the whole collection. And so I get to invite all of the contributors. I think that there are more contributors than us in the audience here. And so I get to invite all of the contributors to turn on their cameras. There we go.
Hello. So I guess we're kind of realizing that an hour is not very much time to try and cover such a large piece of work, and also answer questions. But it's so lovely to see everybody joining us now, and just to have a sense of this collective that we've all spoken about and hopefully spoken to. And that I recognize there's a couple of questions in the chat asking us really about who this work is for. And I guess my sense, at least, is it was kind of for each other to recognize that all of us, I think, in the field recognize that we knew more than we saw represented out there critically. But it's also hopefully, I think everything that Ronald and I read and enjoyed, we felt was completely accessible. So I'm hoping as well that it will inspire more Caribbeanists because we need them. We know that this is a fabulous field to belong to, supportive and encouraging, because we all have so much work to do. And I can see more and more people joining. It's so lovely to see you all. Hello. Hopefully we'll all have a chance to do this in a moment where we can actually raise a glass. I'd rather pathetically, those of you who know me, uncharacteristically have a water bottle present. I'm sorry to disappoint. I promise there will be something more exciting when we are able to do this in person. But it's lovely. In the last 5 minutes, I guess there are, it would be just nice if any of the contributors would like to contribute anything to this conversation. If there's anything that you wanted to say about the volume that we haven't managed to cover, please do say.
Perhaps also to say, Alison, in relation to that question of who the volume is for, I mean, in some ways in doing this work, I also think about it as legacy work, that is also for audiences that are not here yet, that haven't come to the field yet. I know I have enjoyed encountering anthologies from earlier periods that give us sort of a zoom into that moment, even as the field continues to reconstitute itself at different historical moments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled that now I have a book that I could point all my students on my contemporary Caribbean literature course to, and we've now got it online, and it's just like every idea they seem to have come up with for their assignments, I can say, it's in here, read about it. So it's a wonderful resource. So thank you, Alison and Ronald.
Well, I think for me, definitely this is my last editorial project. And so, you know, I hope that it will also inspire those of you who feel that you have the decades of academic life and energy to come to literally, and I honestly do mean it, that, you know, the next iteration should be 6 volumes. So we know that already. I think that's what we felt so keenly. It felt like an opportunity to say so much, and then actually there was so much that we still couldn't fit in, so many writers and critics that we wanted to be able to talk about that couldn't finally be accommodated. So, you know, I look forward to the day when this will be seen as the modest project of 2021 within the kind of scale of criticism to come for this, you know, wonderful field. And I hope, I'm just going to take a picture now of all of us. So I have a sense that we were really here. And to say thank you to you all again. I know our time is running out. Contributors, you do have a Zoom link if you want to have a more informal catch up. Please do follow that in the email that I sent. But thank you everybody as well who's joined to listen to us talk about this. It's really, I think, hopefully conveyed by today's event that it feels like a proper gathering, that, you know, that really we are talking to each other, that a lot of us have kind of grown up as academics, nurtured and supported and challenged and questioned and, you know, helpfully in conversation with each other. And I've, you know, that's certainly been my experience of the generosity and the mentoring and the sort of dialogue that shapes the field. So for those of you who are just joining this field, you know, welcome and well done for making this choice, because I think you've made a great one. And do contact us, you know, if you have other questions, and we will try to answer some of the questions that are in the chat that are probably a bit more challenging than the last minute that we have offers. Ronald, do you want to say a final word?
Just thank you to all the contributors. You know, I know Alison and I were excited to read all the papers as they came in. And to have, you know, dialogue about them. And, you know, by the time we got to writing our introduction, we were just like, there's so much in here, you know, that we also didn't know what to say. But it was a really, really rich project. And I hope it continues to find new and other audiences, and to bring those audiences to Caribbean literature.
Thank you all.